In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a couple appears to live the perfect life. The husband is respected, calm, and admired by everyone around him, while the wife seems gentle and happy on the surface. But behind closed doors, small cracks begin to appear in their so-called perfect marriage. The wife starts noticing disturbing changes in her husband. Late-night calls, emotional distance, and a growing sense that something is deeply wrong. Her fear slowly turns into documentation. She begins recording voice notes and writing down every strange behavior, convinced that if anything ever happens to her, it won't be random. One chilling night, she leaves behind a final message. If anything happens to me, it's him. Soon after, tragedy strikes. She is found dead inside their home with no signs of forced entry. At first, it looks like a mystery, but Detective Sarah Khan arrives and immediately senses something is off. The husband's grief feels too controlled, too rehearsed. As the investigation deepens, inconsistencies in his story begin to surface, and the perfect image of a grieving husband starts to crack. A hidden affair is discovered with a woman named Aisha, who reveals a disturbing truth. The husband was not just unfaithful, but deeply controlling and psychologically manipulative. He kept both women trapped in emotional fear and dependency. Forensic evidence and a recovered deleted voicemail from the wife reveal her final warning. She believed she was in danger and that something was being planned against her. Slowly, the investigation builds a darker picture, not of a crime of passion, but a calculated act driven by obsession and control. When confronted, the husband finally breaks. But instead of remorse, he justifies everything, claiming he was forced into it by her behavior. His confession confirms what investigators feared. This was not just murder, but the result of a deeply controlling and disturbed mindset. In the end, justice is served, but the emotional impact remains. The man everyone trusted is exposed as a hidden manipulator living in plain sight. The story leaves behind a haunting question that lingers long after the case closes. A quiet suburban home stood at the end of a peaceful street where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. Neighbors often described it as perfect, the kind of place where laughter drifted through open windows and warm lights glowed late into the evening. Inside lived a couple everyone admired. He was charming, composed, respected by colleagues and friends alike. She was gentle, soft-spoken, always smiling in photographs that told a simple story of happiness. But perfection, as it often does, was only a surface illusion. The cracks were small at first, almost invisible to anyone who was not looking closely. And she had started looking. It began with little things, moments that did not quite fit the image of the man everyone else saw. A pause before answering simple questions, a sudden shift in tone, the way his eyes sometimes went cold without warning. At night, when the house fell silent, his phone would light up with messages he never explained. He would step outside to take calls, his voice lowered, his words careful. When she asked, he smiled, always that same calm smile, and told her she was overthinking. So she started keeping track. Small notes at first, scribbled thoughts in the corner of her journal, things she told herself she would forget if she did not write them down. Then voice recordings, whispered late at night while he slept beside her, unaware. Her hands would tremble as she spoke, as if saying the words out loud made them more real. She began to question everything, even herself. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe stress was distorting her thoughts. Maybe love required trust even when it felt wrong. But deep down, beneath the doubt, there was a quiet fear growing stronger each day, a feeling she could not ignore anymore. One evening, she sat alone on the edge of the bed, the room dim, her phone clutched tightly in her shaking hand. Her voice was barely a whisper as she recorded what she believed might be her final truth. For a moment, she hesitated, glancing toward the door, listening for his footsteps in the hallway. There was nothing, only silence pressing in around her. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out despite the fear tightening in her chest. If anything happens to me, it's him. The recording ended, but the weight of what she had said lingered in the air, like something alive. She quickly saved the file, hiding it among dozens of others, a quiet archive of fear and truth. Across the house, a floorboard creaked. Her breath caught instantly. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. She turned toward the door, heart pounding, forcing her expression into something normal. It opened. He stood there, watching her, his face unreadable, his presence filling the room with an unspoken tension. She managed a faint smile, but deep inside, she knew something irreversible had already begun that night, and it was. The door had barely closed behind him when the silence turned heavy, pressing against the walls like something waiting to break. She forced a smile, but her hands betrayed her, trembling at her sides as he stepped closer, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something hidden beneath her calm. He didn't ask anything. He never did anymore. Instead, he simply nodded once, a quiet gesture that carried more weight than words, before turning away. But the look he gave her lingered, sharp and knowing, leaving her breath uneven long after he disappeared down the hallway. Hours later, the house was no longer quiet. Police sirens tore through the night, red and blue lights flashing violently against the walls that once held their perfect life. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in disbelief as officers rushed in, their footsteps echoing through rooms now filled with something far darker than silence. She was found on the bedroom floor, lifeless, her phone lying just inches away. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no struggle that anyone could clearly define. It was as if whatever happened had been allowed to happen. He stood in the living room, surrounded by officers, his face pale, his voice shaking just enough to sound real. He said he found her like that. He said he didn't understand. He said he loved her. And yet, something about him felt controlled, almost too precise, like every word had been carefully chosen long before this moment arrived. Even his grief seemed measured, contained within invisible boundaries he refused to cross. Detective Sarah Khan arrived just after midnight, her presence quiet but observant. She didn't speak much at first, choosing instead to watch, to listen, to absorb the details others overlooked. Her eyes moved from the body to the room, then finally to the husband. There was something wrong here. She could feel it immediately, a subtle imbalance that didn't match the story being told. The room was too clean, the positioning too deliberate, the atmosphere strangely staged. She stepped closer, her gaze narrowing slightly as she noticed the smallest details others ignored. The phone, the angle, the distance, pieces that didn't quite fit together. Then she looked at him again. He met her eyes for a brief second, and in that moment, something shifted. Not fear, not grief, something colder, something that vanished almost instantly, replaced again by the image of a broken husband. Sarah didn't react, but inside, a quiet certainty began to form. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was something far more calculated. And as the body was taken away and the house slowly emptied, she knew this case was only beginning, and the truth hiding within this marriage was far more dangerous than anyone was ready to face. Because somewhere in that quiet home, beneath the illusion of love, a story was waiting to be uncovered, one that would unravel every lie and lead directly to a truth no one would believe. The door had barely closed behind him when the silence turned heavy, pressing against the walls like something waiting to break. She forced a smile, but her hands betrayed her, trembling at her sides as he stepped closer, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something hidden beneath her calm. He didn't ask anything. He never did anymore. Instead, he simply nodded once, a quiet gesture that carried more weight than words, before turning away. But the look he gave her lingered, sharp and knowing, leaving her breath uneven long after he disappeared down the hallway. Hours later, the house was no longer quiet. Police sirens tore through the night, red and blue lights flashing violently against the walls that once held their perfect life. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in disbelief as officers rushed in, their footsteps echoing through rooms now filled with something far darker than silence. She was found on the bedroom floor, lifeless, her phone lying just inches away. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no struggle that anyone could clearly define. It was as if whatever happened had been allowed to happen. He stood in the living room, surrounded by officers, his face pale, his voice shaking just enough to sound real. He said he found her like that. He said he didn't understand. He said he loved her. And yet, something about him felt controlled, almost too precise, like every word had been carefully chosen long before this moment arrived. Even his grief seemed measured, contained within invisible boundaries he refused to cross. Detective Sarah Khan arrived just after midnight, her presence quiet but observant. She didn't speak much at first, choosing instead to watch, to listen, to absorb the details others overlooked. Her eyes moved from the body to the room, then finally to the husband. There was something wrong here. She could feel it immediately, a subtle imbalance that didn't match the story being told. The room was too clean, the positioning too deliberate, the atmosphere strangely staged. She stepped closer, her gaze narrowing slightly as she noticed the smallest details others ignored. The phone, the angle, the distance, pieces that didn't quite fit together. Then she looked at him again. He met her eyes for a brief second, and in that moment, something shifted. Not fear, not grief, something colder, something that vanished almost instantly, replaced again by the image of a broken husband. Sarah didn't react, but inside, a quiet certainty began to form. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was something far more calculated. And as the body was taken away and the house slowly emptied, she knew this case was only beginning, and the truth hiding within this marriage was far more dangerous than anyone was ready to face. Because somewhere in that quiet home, beneath the illusion of love, a story was waiting to be uncovered, one that would unravel every lie and lead directly to a truth no one would believe. The investigation did not slow. It deepened, pulling at threads that refused to stay buried. Detective Sarah Khan spent hours reviewing phone records, messages, and fragments of conversations that painted an incomplete but troubling picture. One number appeared again and again, always late at night, always just out of context. It led her to a woman who had never been mentioned before. Her name was Aisha. At first glance, she was nothing more than a colleague, someone who worked closely with a husband, someone whose connections seemed harmless on the surface. But as Sarah dug deeper, harmless began to look like a carefully maintained lie. The messages between them were not professional. They were intimate, coded, filled with meaning hidden beneath ordinary words. This was not recent. It stretched back years, quietly existing alongside a marriage everyone believed was perfect. When Aisha was brought in for questioning, she appeared calm, but her hands told a different story. They trembled slightly, fingers twisting together as if trying to hold something in. "I didn't know this would happen," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. Sarah watched her closely, saying nothing, allowing the silence to pull more truth to the surface. It wasn't just an affair, Aisha finally admitted. It was control. She described a version of him no one else had seen, a man who could switch without warning, from charming to cold, from loving to distant. "He made me feel like I couldn't leave," she whispered, eyes fixed on the table. "Like everything would fall apart if I did." Her words hung heavy, each one revealing a pattern that mirrored what Sarah had already begun to suspect. This wasn't love. It was something darker, something rooted in power and fear. And then Aisha hesitated. There was more, something she wasn't sure she should say. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Tell me," she said. Aisha took a breath before speaking again. "I saw him angry once," she said, her voice dropping. "It wasn't normal. It was like he became someone else." Sarah felt the pieces shifting into place, each detail sharpening the image of a man carefully hiding behind perfection. This testimony didn't prove anything yet, but it changed everything. As Aisha left the room, she paused at the door, her expression conflicted, fear lingering in her eyes. "Be careful," she said softly. Sarah didn't respond immediately, but her gaze hardened slightly as the weight of the warning settled in. Because now, this case wasn't just about a dead wife. It was about a man who might be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And somewhere within his carefully controlled world, there were still secrets waiting to surface. Darker truths buried beneath layers of silence and fear that no one had fully uncovered yet. Truths that would soon begin to unravel everything, leading Sarah closer to a moment she could feel approaching, a confrontation that would force the husband to reveal what he had been hiding. The warning lingered in Sarah's mind as the investigation pressed forward, each new detail sharpening the outline of something deliberate. The husband's story had remained steady, almost too steady, as if rehearsed and protected from change. But evidence was beginning to resist him, quietly exposing fractures beneath the surface of his carefully constructed narrative. Forensic teams worked through the house with patience, collecting details that did not belong to grief. There were inconsistencies in the timeline, subtle but undeniable, moments where his version of events simply did not align. The positioning of objects, the absence of struggle, even the silence of the room itself suggested something controlled rather than chaotic. Sarah stood near the bedroom doorway, watching technicians move carefully, her thoughts building into a pattern she could no longer ignore. This was not sudden. This was prepared. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A deleted voicemail, hidden deep within recovered data, pulled back from near erasure. The timestamp placed it just hours before her death. Sarah listened once, then again, her expression tightening with each word. The wife's voice was shaking, breath uneven, fear unmistakable. "I know what he's doing," she whispered. "It's not just lies anymore. He's planning something." There was a pause, a fragile silence filled with dread. "If anyone hears this, please don't ignore it. I'm not safe." The recording ended abruptly, leaving behind a void that felt heavier than sound. Sarah lowered the device slowly, her mind racing through every detail collected so far. Control, obsession, isolation. Each piece aligned with disturbing precision, forming a psychological pattern that pointed toward intent rather than impulse. This was not a moment of rage. It was something colder, something calculated long before that night ever arrived. She began mapping connections, linking Aisha's testimony with the evidence now unfolding. The husband's behavior, his control over both women, his ability to manipulate perception, it all led toward one possibility. He had planned this. As the realization settled in, Sarah felt the case shift beneath her feet, moving from suspicion to something far more dangerous. Somewhere inside that quiet house, the truth had been waiting, carefully hidden but never gone. And now, piece by piece, it was beginning to surface, pulling her closer to a confrontation she could no longer delay. Because the more she uncovered, the clearer it became that he was not finished yet, and whatever he had started inside that marriage was far from over. The next step would not just reveal the truth, it would force him to respond, and Sarah knew that when he did, the mask he wore so perfectly would finally begin to crack, exposing the man beneath in ways no one could ignore. And that moment was coming fast, closer than anyone expected, waiting just beyond the fragile edge of control he was struggling to maintain. The truth would not stay buried, and when it finally surfaced, it would change everything, dragging them all into a final reckoning, none of them. The pressure had been building for days, tightening around him like something he could no longer control. Sarah knew it was time. The evidence, the patterns, the inconsistencies, they had all led to this moment. Now, it wasn't just about what he had done. It was about who he really was beneath the carefully crafted image. The interrogation room was quiet, almost suffocating in its stillness. He sat across from her, composed as ever, hands folded neatly, eyes steady. At first glance, he looked exactly like the grieving husband everyone expected. But Sarah had learned to look beyond that. "You said you found her," Sarah began calmly. "I did," he replied, his voice measured, controlled. "I've told you everything." She nodded slightly, sliding a file across the table. "Then help me understand why your timeline doesn't match the evidence." For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. A crack. "I was in shock," he said, his tone tightening. "People don't remember things clearly in situations like that." Sarah leaned forward just enough to hold his gaze. "Or they remember too well and try to adjust the story." Silence filled the room again, heavier this time. His fingers shifted slightly, no longer as still as before. "You think I did this," he said, a faint edge creeping into his voice. "I think you're not telling the truth." His jaw tightened. The calm began to slip, replaced by something colder. Defensive, controlled but strained. "You don't know what our marriage was like," he said quietly. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She let him continue. "She wasn't easy," he added, his voice lowering. "She questioned everything. She pushed. There it was. Not grief. Justification." "And what did you do when she pushed?" Sarah asked. He looked at her, then really looked, and something in his eyes shifted completely. The mask was still there, but thinner now, fragile. "I handled it," he said. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. Sarah felt it clearly now, the underlying truth that had been hiding beneath every word, every action. This wasn't about anger or loss. It was about control, the need to dominate, to shape reality, to ensure nothing and no one moved beyond his reach. "You didn't just want control," she said quietly. "You needed it." For the first time, he didn't deny it. Instead, a faint, almost unsettling smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. The illusion was breaking. And Sarah knew that whatever came next would not just expose the truth. It would force him to reveal the part of himself he had been hiding all along, the part capable of turning control into something far more dangerous. Because now, he was no longer just defending himself. He was unraveling. And when a man like him begins to break, the truth doesn't come out gently. It comes out all at once in ways that can no longer be contained, leading directly to the moment where everything finally collapses into a confession no one could ignore. The silence inside the interrogation room felt different now, heavier, charged with something on the verge of breaking. Sarah didn't rush. She knew pressure like this didn't need force. It needed patience. He sat there, no longer perfectly composed. The cracks were visible now, small shifts in posture, restless hands, a tension he could no longer fully hide. The mask was slipping, and he knew it. Sarah placed the phone on the table and pressed play. The wife's voice filled the room, fragile, trembling, undeniable. "If anything happens to me, it's him." The words lingered long after the recording stopped. For the first time, he didn't look at Sarah. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, his breathing uneven. Something inside him had been disturbed, something he could not easily control. "You heard it," Sarah said quietly. She knew. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, as if rejecting the reality pressing in around him. "She didn't understand," he murmured. Sarah leaned forward, her voice firm but calm. "Then help me understand." That was the moment everything shifted. He looked up suddenly, his expression no longer controlled, no longer calculated. There was anger there now, raw and unfiltered, pushing through the cracks of his carefully built persona. "You think this is simple?" he snapped. "You think I just woke up and decided to do this?" Sarah didn't interrupt. She let him unravel. "She pushed me," he continued, his voice rising. "Every day, questioning, doubting, watching me like I was the problem." His hands moved as he spoke, restless, agitated, as if trying to release something trapped inside him. "I gave her everything," he said, his tone shifting again, softer but more unsettling. "And it was never enough." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "So you killed her." The words landed hard, cutting through everything else. He froze for a second, then exhaled sharply, as if something inside him had finally given way. "Yes," he said. There was no hesitation this time. No denial. Just a cold, quiet acceptance. But it wasn't followed by regret. "She left me no choice," he added, his voice steadying again. "She was going to ruin everything. She was going to destroy me." Sarah felt the weight of it settle in the room. This wasn't guilt. It was justification. "You planned it," she said. He didn't deny that either. Instead, a faint, unsettling calm returned to his expression. "I had to," he replied. The confession hung in the air, undeniable, irreversible. But it wasn't the end. Because as Sarah studied him, she realized something far more disturbing. He didn't believe he was wrong. Not truly. In his mind, this wasn't murder. It was control restored. And that truth was more dangerous than the confession itself, leaving only one question remaining. What kind of justice could exist for someone who didn't believe they had committed a crime at all?